Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of our screencast lecture on nutrition, metabolism, and body temperature regulation. Whenever we left off in part one, we were taking a look at how insulin affects carbohydrate metabolism and also how it affects lipid metabolism. Today, we're going to take a look at how insulin affects protein metabolism, the third of our basically four major nutrients that we find in food. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we see is that insulin will stimulate the uptake of amino acids in cells whenever it is in high concentrations, whenever it's produced and flowing through the bloodstream. The insulin will stimulate the uptake of those amino acids, and that'll contribute to protein anabolism. In other words, whenever insulin levels are high, that indicates that there's plenty of carbohydrates in the bloodstream, and we're trying to get those carbs out of the bloodstream, and cells can use those carbohydrates as a source of energy. Proteins would not be necessary as a source of energy. And as a matter of fact, proteins are more important for building cell structure and the formation of enzymes. So when insulin levels are high, cells will be stimulated to take up not only the glucose from the blood, but also stimulated to take up amino acids and use those amino acids to build proteins that they need, both structural proteins and enzymes to help to catalyze chemical reactions in cells. However, when insulin levels are low, let's say we haven't eaten for an extended period of time, or because we're not getting very many carbs in the diet, that's going to push the cells towards protein catabolism. In other words, what cells will do in response to low levels of insulin is almost kind of say, oh, there must not be enough glucose present to provide for energy. Maybe fat stores are already been pretty much used up. And now what the cells will do is start to break down proteins, structural proteins that they have within themselves, and use the amino acids from those proteins to carry out cellular respiration, which is not a good thing. It's not what we want to have happen. We think about, let's say, for example, anorexia or bulimia. In anorexia, patients tend to restrict their diets and eat very, very little. And so their insulin levels are going to be low because they're not getting the other nutrients into their bloodstream. So the body cells still need a source of energy to carry out their daily activities. Where are they going to get that energy from? Well, they'll start to break down proteins to get the energy that they need. And what are some high sources of protein? One of the characteristics of anorexia or bulimia over an extended period of time is the hair tends to become brittle because we'll take proteins from the hair. The heart muscle becomes weakened because the heart is a very, heart muscle is a very good source of protein. And so what will happen is these proteins that make up the muscle cells will start to be used as a source of energy. The protein will be broken down into amino acids, and the amino acids will then enter the cellular respiration process to provide for ATP for cell activity. So that's what I kind of want to focus on here. I want to focus on what happens when proteins are broken down into amino acids, and then those amino acids are used as a source of energy in cells. Well, the breakdown of proteins into amino acids is called proteolysis. And during proteolysis, what's going to happen is the protein is going to be hydrolyzed. That means enzymes will add a molecule of water between the amino acids in the protein. And that will cause the protein to begin to break down into the individual amino acids. Once the individual amino acids form, they will then enter the mitochondrion to be broken down and used to provide for ATP. As they enter the mitochondrion, the amino acids will undergo a process called deamination. If you recall, amino acids have a central carbon. They have an amine group on one side and a carboxyl group on the other side of the centrally located or alpha carbon. And what has to happen in order for the proteins to be, or the amino acids to be used for cellular respiration is the amine group has to be removed. Once the amine group is removed or deamination takes place, this is going to result in a carbon skeleton that's going to enter the Krebs cycle from one of three locations. And that's going to depend upon how complex the amino acid is. You know, we have amino acids that run anywhere from having those side chains, having a single hydrogen for the side chain, to having very, very complex side chains. So depending upon the size of the amino acid, the complexity of the amino acid, based upon those side chains, or what we call the quote R group, the amino acid is going to then enter the Krebs cycle once inside the mitochondrion from one of three locations. So here's kind of a map that kind of maps everything out. Now we're going to focus on the proteins here. We've already done triglycerides and carbohydrates, but just to recall, remember what happens that triglycerides are made up of a glycerol plus three fatty acids, and they're going to be broken down into an individual glycerol and then into the three fatty acids. The glycerol, once inside the mitochondria, will be attacked by enzymes and converted to a pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid then will be hydrolyzed down into acetyl groups, which will be picked up by an enzyme helper called coenzyme A. And the acetyl groups will then enter the Krebs cycle, and as we say, yada, 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 the dismantling will take place. Fatty acids themselves will be split and broken down into two carbon groups, acetyl groups, which will be picked up by coenzyme A and transferred to the mitochondrion as well. So remember, fatty acids are long chains of carbon atoms. So we take those carbon atoms and we break them down into groups of two, and then they're picked up by CoA and taken into the Krebs cycle to be metabolized to produce ATP. We're focusing here on proteins, just a little bit on glycogen. Glycogen is starch, right? And starch is made up of long chains of glucose molecules. So the glycogen is going to be broken down into individual glucose molecules. The glucose molecules will be then split to form molecules of pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid will be then hydrolyzed into two carbon acetyl groups and picked up by CoA and then enter the Krebs cycle. With regard to proteins, remember proteins, their basic building block units are amino acids. And here it depends upon the complexity of the amino acid, as we talked about. Some amino acids can be converted directly to pyruvic acid, and which is converted into the acetyl group, picked up by CoA, and then transferred to the Krebs cycle. Some amino acids will be broken into two carbon acetyl groups and directly enter the Krebs cycle. And then other amino acids still may just simply enter right into the Krebs cycle themselves. So we're really kind of going from more complex to simpler amino acids as we take a look at these three pathways. Okay, I don't want to get all hung up on that in too much detail. I think that's pretty much enough for now on that. But let's take a closer look at amino acids. So proteins are made up of amino acids, and with regard to amino acids, not all amino acids we know are the same. We have polar and nonpolar amino acids, we have neutral amino acids, so on and so forth. But we can also classify amino acids by whether or not they can be synthesized by our body. And so we have two classes of amino acids based upon that factor. The first class are what we call non-essential amino acids. Non-essential amino acids are ones that can be synthesized by converting one amino acid to another in the liver. In other words, if you don't get these amino acids from the foods you eat in your diet, well, that's okay. Your liver will convert other amino acids into them. And remember, these amino acids are going to be important for building your proteins that you need in your body. So 11 amino acids then are classified as non-essential. Now, non-essential only means that you don't need to get them from your diet. Let's keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that you don't need them to build your proteins. It simply means that you don't need to get them from your diet, because if you don't, your liver will convert other amino acids into these 11 non-essential amino acids. The other class of amino acids are what we call essential amino acids. These are ones that you must obtain from your diet. That's what the term essential means. It's essential that you get these amino acids from your diet, because if you don't, the liver can't synthesize them, and they are necessary to build the proteins that you need to make up the structural components of your body cells and enzymes that are, again, necessary for um, catalyzing chemical reactions in cells. Now, whenever we look at essential amino acids, animal protein is likely to contain all the essential amino acids. And therefore, we oftentimes refer to as animal protein as a complete protein, because it has all of those amino acids. On the other hand, plant proteins oftentimes will lack some of those essential amino acids. Therefore, plant protein is oftentimes referred to as an incomplete protein. Now, again, we don't have time to get into this in a whole lot of detail, but just to give you an example here. So that's a consideration for vegetarians, and particularly vegans, who choose not to eat meat, and in some cases, in vegans, not to eat anything that has that is derived from or comes from an animal source. And so those individuals have to be very careful about their diet and what foods they choose to eat. Some plants will have some of the essential amino acids, the plant proteins, and other plants, the plant proteins, will have other essential amino acids. So for vegans and for vegetarians, they have to be careful to make sure they eat foods from different food groups, so that they're getting enough of the incomplete proteins to supply all the essential amino acids that they need in their diet. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay. Next up, as we begin to wrap things up here, I'd just like to talk about metabolic states. So when we talk about metabolic states, we have, first of all, what we call the absorptive or fed state. During this time, food substances are being absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract and into the bloodstream. So the absorptive state occurs just after you've had a meal. That's why it's oftentimes referred to as the fed state. During this time, insulin levels are likely to be high because of the carbohydrates that you've taken in. You've ingested the food, broken down the complex carbohydrates. Glucose levels are going to go up in the blood, and that's going to stimulate the cells of the pancreas to start to produce insulin in those islets of Langerhans. The other state we have is the post-absorptive or fasting state. During this time, your body's needs are going to be met by materials that are already present in the body. So this is a time when you haven't eaten. Let's say, for example, you get up in the morning, you have something to eat, you're in the fed state. Now you go out to classes, you go to your job, you go to work, you do whatever you're going to be doing throughout the day, and hours go by and you haven't eaten. So what's going to happen? Now the nutrients have been absorbed, and you're not getting nutrients from your diet, from eating. You're now in the fasting state. Now your body's needs for these nutrients, glucose, fatty acids, proteins, are all going to be met by the ones that are already present in your body. During this time, glucose levels, let's focus on them for a minute. Glucose levels are going to be maintained by homeostasis. So if your blood glucose level drops, what's going to happen? Pancreas is going to produce glucagon. Glucagon is going to stimulate the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose back into the bloodstream to bring the glucose levels back up again. Glucagon, so at this time, may be high for the reason that we just mentioned. Okay, whenever the blood glucose levels are low, that's going to stimulate the production of glucagon by the pancreas, and that's going to cause the liver again to release the glucose into the blood by breaking down glycogen. Okay, next up, just very quickly, I want to wrap things up talking a little bit about thermoregulation. So thermoregulation refers to maintaining proper body temperature, that 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Chemical pathways involved in digestion and ATP metabolism, we'll start there, tend to be exothermic. Exothermic means heat yielding. So in other words, the chemical reactions that are involved in digesting food and breaking down ATP, and we've kind of referred to this in the past, tend to release excess energy as heat into the surrounding environment. So these chemical pathways are exothermic, heat producing or heat yielding. So your body temperature is going to reflect then a homeostatic balance between heat production, which can occur, let's say, for example, when we're digesting food or breaking down ATP, or even when our muscles are active, with heat loss. So body temperature, once again, is going to reflect the homeostatic balance that has to be maintained between heat production and heat loss to keep that ideal body temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. So who's responsible for this homeostatic balance? Well, there's a little guy right here. Let's take a look. Here's a sagittal section of the brain. We're going to focus in on this little green area right here, which is at the base of the thalamus called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is oftentimes referred to as your body's thermostat because it is responsible for maintaining proper body temperature. The hypothalamus is set. It kind of works like the thermostat in your home. And you set a thermostat to maintain a particular temperature in your house. Let's say, for example, you want the temperature to be 72 degrees Fahrenheit in the wintertime and 72 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. So you have the furnace and you have the air conditioning in your house, if you're fortunate enough, unlike me, to have air conditioning in your home. Okay, so what happens if the temperature starts to drop, let's say a little below 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the thermostat sends a signal to the furnace to causes the furnace to kick on, and the furnace produces the heat to warm your house back up again. On the other hand, if the temperature, let's say for example, in the summertime goes above 72, the thermostat will send a signal to the air conditioning unit to kick on and to bring the temperature back down. Within a few degrees one way or the other, this thermostat will work. Well, the hypothalamus works the same way. The hypothalamus keeps your body temperature set between 36.5 and 37.8 degrees Celsius. So if your body temperature goes above 37.8 degrees Celsius, the hypothalamus will send the signals out that will cause body physiology to change in such a way as to bring that temperature back down towards 37. However, if the body temperature drops below 36.5, let's say it's a cold day outside and our body temperature starts to drop, the hypothalamus again will signal body physiology that will result in an increase in body temperature, bringing it back up to 37 degrees Celsius, or at least attempting to do that. Now, how does the hypothalamus do that? It does that by maintaining or by heat loss and heat promoting mechanisms. Those are the physiologies that we were talking about there. So let's take a look at this. So we can compare the heat promoting mechanisms and heat loss mechanisms that the hypothalamus uses to help maintain proper body temperature. So with regard to heat promoting mechanisms, the hypothalamus will stimulate, let's say, for example, now our body temperature has started to drop down below that 37 degrees Celsius, okay, 36.5. So what's going to happen now is the hypothalamus will send out signals that will result in vasoconstriction, the constriction of blood vessels. This will reduce the flow of blood toward the periphery of the body. So the extremities are going to get less blood. We're going to try to keep the blood deep in the body because when the body gets out around the extremities, that's where you can have a lot of radiational heat loss. So we want to try to conserve that heat as much as possible. We can also conserve heat by closing the sweat glands. Sweat glands are ducted glands, and the ducts can carry water to the surface of the skin. And when the water evaporates off the surface of the skin, it can take heat away. Well, our body temperature is already too low, so let's stop the loss of heat. Twist shut the ducts of the sweat glands, close off those sweat glands, even deactivate the sweat glands, so water now is not coming to the surface of the skin to evaporate. So we restrict the flow of blood to just underneath the surface of the skin, and we close the sweat glands. This helps to retain the heat that our body has. Now, in addition, we can also then start to shiver. And what happens whenever we shiver? Well, we go all the way back to our discussion in the muscular system at the beginning of the semester. We know that when muscles undergo contraction, ATP is necessary to cause the sliding filament hypothesis to occur. And when ATP is broken down, remember, little energy is transferred. Only about 40% of the energy that's released when ATP is broken down is transferred to the myosin cross bridge. Full 60% is lost to the surrounding environment. Lost as what? It's lost as heat. So whenever we shiver, we get a lot of heat production, and that can help to bring the body temperature back up. And that can be enhanced by vasoconstriction and sweat gland closing. Okay, what about heat loss mechanisms? So let's say now that our body temperature is going up above the normal range and we want to try to bring the body temperature back down again. We would do the opposite. Now vasodilation, the hypothalamus is going to signal vasodilation. Dilation of the blood vessels that carry blood to just underneath the surface of the skin and out to the extremities. What's that going to do? That's going to increase radiational cooling. Think about radiators at your home, and if you have hot water heat, when the water passes through the pipes of the radiators, heat radiates out from the water. Think of your blood as being the water that's passing through the tubes of the blood vessels, the tubes we call blood vessels, and what's going to happen? Now you're going to have radiational cooling if the blood is just underneath the surface of the skin or out near the extremities. Make sense? Okay, so that's going to allow excess heat to be dissipated to help bring the body temperature back down. At the same time, those sweat glands that were closed, we can open them back up again to allow water now to come to the surface of the skin. And when water comes to the surface of the skin, when the water evaporates, it's going to take heat away. Okay, and that's going to help bring the body temperature back down again. Now, we're not going to have anything opposite of shivering because we don't want the muscles to be active, because if the muscles are active, that's going to help to promote heat, not heat loss. Now, there are a lot of other physiologic mechanisms that can kick in, but these are the major heat loss and heat promoting mechanisms that we take a look at here. And you've probably seen this before. Thermal regulation is a good example of a negative feedback mechanism of homeostatic regulation. And so that you tend to study in A and P1. So this chart, you can look this over. This chart just rehashes what we just talked about with regard to what's going to happen if the body temperature goes too high or if the body temperature goes too low. So take some time and just kind of review that chart in your PowerPoints. And then finally, just a couple of healthcare applications that are associated with thermal regulation, why it's important to study it. We talk about frostbite. Frostbite is an extended restriction of blood flow to the skin. And as a result of that, skin cells become deprived of oxygen and nutrients, and they begin to die. So think about it. You're in a frostbite situation, it would be where your body temperature has started to drop too low. And now you're trying to bring the temperature up or at least conserve heat so that heat loss is not occurring so rapidly. So as we mentioned before, what's going to happen? Vasoconstriction is going to take place. We're going to constrict the blood vessels that carry blood just underneath the surface of the skin and out to the extremities. We're going to try to keep the blood deep in the body core, where those essential organs like the brain and the heart are going to be supported by trying to keep the blood warmer. So the end result is that we preserve the heart, we preserve the brain, but we may lose a finger or an ear in the process. Now, associated with frostbite is hypothermia. Hypothermia is defined as an extremely low body temperature that's due to prolonged exposure to the cold. In hypothermia, what's going to happen is vital signs are going to begin to decrease. So blood pressure is going to go down, heart rate's going to go down, body temperature is dropping, right? All the normal things that we think of with the vital signs. They're going to decrease. As a result of that, the individual is going to become drowsy and oddly comfortable. Why is that? Well, think about capillary exchange. Well, all these things are really coming together now. But think about capillary exchange. If the blood pressure is a little bit lower, you're not going to have as high a pressure to push things out on one side of the blood vessel. So you don't get as much exchange of nutrients and water. And so the brain cells aren't going to get as many nutrients as they normally would. They're not going to be able to be as active because they're not getting as much, let's say, glucose for energy to be active. And so they're going to decrease in their activity. As they do, the individual is going to become drowsy and, oddly enough, they'll become comfortable. If hypothermia continues for an extended period of time, it can progress to even coma and death as the vital signs continue to drop. The opposite of hypothermia is hyperthermia. Hyperthermia is an elevated body temperature. This occurs whenever heat production exceeds heat loss capacity. In other words, you're producing heat so rapidly that you're producing it more quickly than you can get rid of it. So what happens? The body temperature goes above the normal range and stays above the normal range. Now, there are some symptoms of hypo or hyperthermia that we can talk about. The first is heat cramps. These are painful muscle spasms that occur in areas like the abdomen, the arms, or legs, and this is due to a lack of salt. So we're losing sodium, because with this hyperthermia, the heat loss mechanisms are kicking in. Those sweat glands are going to be really highly activated. Water is going to be coming to the surface, and if you've ever tasted your perspiration, your sweat, there's a lot of salt in it. And whenever you lose all that salt, what's going to happen is sodium levels are going to drop And sodium levels are very important for uh, uh, maintaining that transmembrane potential that is exceedingly important for nerve cells and muscle cells to do their job. So the muscle cells start to not they get in a state of contraction and they can't relax and the cramps start to set in. Now heat cramps can be followed then by heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion is characterized by profuse sweating. So that body temperature is so high, we're sweating profusely, trying to do everything we can to bring as much water to the body surface and have that water evaporate to try to bring the body temperature back down. This is usually also characterized by a pale skin color, weakness, loss of coordination because of the loss of water. We don't have proper water balance. Uh, Dehydration is going to result in headaches, dizziness. The individual may faint. They may get nauseated and start to vomit as well. Because what's going to happen is cells are going to begin to shut down. And in the digestive system, if you can't digest food, then you're going to get rid of it. You get nauseated and throw up. And then the third component that we talk about here associated with hyperthermia is heat stroke. Heat stroke is a true medical emergency. It's characterized by an absence of sweating. Now, whenever you look at that, if you have a person in heat exhaustion and they're profusely sweating, and you're worried, oh, they're profusely sweating because their body temperature is too high, and suddenly they stop sweating, you might tend to think, oh, they stopped sweating, so their body temperature must have come down. Well, no, it's an indicator that they don't have any more water left to be able to sweat out. Now they lost a major mechanism, sweating and water evaporation, to help bring the body temperature back down. So now the body temperature can rapidly go up. With all that loss of water, blood pressure is going to drop, so the heart's going to start beating more rapidly to try to keep the pressure up. The individual may have difficulty breathing. They may start to show strange behaviors. They will be confused, become agitated, disoriented, and it can even lead to seizure and coma. Whenever you think about the strange behavior, confusion, agitation, it sounds a lot like what? Stroke. So it'd be, we've got low blood pressure in the brain, so we're not getting good capillary exchange, not getting good nutrients to the cells, and so their activity is going to be in jeopardy because they're not getting what they need to continue on. That can lead to the seizure, coma, and eventually the death of the individual. Well, I think that completes our PowerPoint on nutrition, metabolism, and body temperature. And we'll see you next time for the urinary system.